ass game between the Celtics and Lakers last night. It was entertaining, but I cannot say that it did not hurt at the end. Yeah, Rondo just finally decided to hit a game winner, the first game winner of his career, while a member of the Los Angeles Lakers on the Celtics home court. But what's more important to this video is what was said after that game, or I don't know when it was said, but apparently somebody asked LeBron something, or maybe he just brought this up, and he said something that I want to respectfully but heavily disagree with. And I saw a lot of responses to what he said that I also want to disagree with or argue against, because I feel like there's a very common sense answer to this and people are just saying facts like there's just nothing to argue against. So LeBron says that those top teams in the East, yeah, they're going for it. Toronto is going for it, Milwaukee's going for it, Philly. Boston believes that they can do it too. They know they ain't got to go through Cleveland anymore. Everybody in the East thinks that they can get to the finals because they ain't got to go through me. Well, first of all, I'm not even going to lie, I had to check if he actually said that because I was like, wow, that's a bit forward. But you know, that's the one thing I appreciated about LeBron, especially on his show. He just says what he feels. I like to know what players actually feel rather than them sugarcoating shit and giving same media answers. I actually appreciate stuff like this. But I am still going to respectfully and heavily disagree. And I'm going to cover all aspects. I'm going to cover last year and the 7 years before that, LeBron's 8 straight finals, as it pertains to what he's saying. So basically he's arguing that the moment I leave the East, all of a sudden it's wide open, a bunch of teams are going for it, teams are leveling up, Marc Gasol is on the Raptors, the Bucks are good and they added some pieces, the Sixers redid their roster, like, you know, shit is popping now that I'm gone. Well, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me to take that approach though. I think there's credit, and then I think there's too much credit, and I think that's where this falls. See, last year was LeBron James's weakest Cleveland team. As a matter of fact, it was the weakest team he had been on since he left for Miami. There had never been a LeBron James-led team in the last 8 years that was this vulnerable, that was this able to be beaten. So they went to 7 with the Pacers in the first round, which I think was a surprise for a lot of people. Then they went to 7 with Boston. And this is Boston without Kyrie, without Hayward, and it had been turmoil the entire year. All the locker room tension where they traded the whole team, then they get this team and it's just like, it's the worst thing since, that was actually the worst team I think he's had since 07. Would have to fact check it, but yeah, that was at least the worst finals team. So that team makes it to the NBA finals, and I picked them to beat Toronto last year. I thought that was going to happen because I was just under the impression no matter how good Toronto was with DeRozan and Lowry, I just didn't think, I thought LeBron owned them and I was right. But I didn't think they were going to get swept. I think I called a 6-game series, but a sweep, that took me off my feet. That's where I was like, wow, LeBron is just different. But then they get to meet Boston, who doesn't have 2 of their best players, and that series was minutes away from Boston winning it. So forever, I'm always going to say that if Boston at least had Kyrie, they were going to the finals. Cleveland was not that great of a team. And with those events, we get to this summer, and let's look what changed. First of all, Boston didn't really change anything. They just got healthy, and that's not up to anybody. Those are freak accidents. That's luck. Health is just whatever it is. So Boston was gonna be here or they weren't, one way or the other. Toronto. Does Toronto trade for Kawhi Leonard if LeBron James is in the East or not? I think they do. Why would they have not have made that move either way? After they got swept by what was LeBron's weakest team, and especially the weakest team that they had faced him with, the DeRozan and Lowry run was over. It wasn't going anywhere. So that move still happens. The Milwaukee Bucks. I would argue that moves they made, like getting Brook Lopez, hiring Mike Budenholzer, weren't those moves more in response to what was going on in Boston? Because they were embarrassingly beat by Boston that did not have the best players. They knew that regardless of what LeBron was doing, Boston was probably going to be the next power that they had to deal with in the East. So after being ousted in what was that, 5 games? I thought those changes were in order regardless. And then the Sixers. Are you going to tell me that the Sixers are not going to trade anything for Jimmy Butler this season because LeBron is playing with who again? Like this year's Cleveland roster, that's what would stop the Sixers from trading for Butler? So then the argument to that is, well, no, because if LeBron stayed in Cleveland, they would have probably gotten better. And that's what the moves are in response to. They're not going to make so many moves if they don't think they can be a better LeBron team. But that is the reason that LeBron James, that's one of the reasons I thought that LeBron left Cleveland, because the Cavaliers were in a no-win situation. They had traded Kyrie, their cap space was screwed, They had bad contracts, so they had no bargaining chips to actually get better and start really contending again. So seeing how screwed that situation was, I thought that was really one of the things that led LeBron to leaving, because if they still had Kyrie and their relationship hadn't have deteriorated, a lot of people expected that LeBron would have been there to end his career. So keep that in mind, that if LeBron James stayed in Cleveland over the summer, there probably wouldn't have been any major moves to make them any better. They really didn't have the pieces to get that done. LeBron said himself he had done plenty of recruiting to Cleveland over his years and nobody wanted to go there. So what was going to happen that was going to scare the rest of the East to not trying to get better? So the Eastern Conference that we sit with right now in February, it was trending this way already. Last year, that was the big story, that Boston was on the up and up, that these Sixers with Joel Embiid and Simmons, they were going to be a problem in the future. They needed some roster moves, which they made. They needed some improvement. We were already wondering when Giannis was really going to take that next step into being an actual contender, when he was going to take that team into being an actual contender. And I haven't even mentioned the Pacers, who before the Oladipo injury had gotten much better from last season. That's the team that took Cleveland to 7 in the first round last year. You could argue a couple of non-coaching screw-ups in that game 7 and they might have beaten them. So I think this new narrative that had popped up a while ago, by the way, it's just that LeBron now himself believes in it. I think this narrative that the East just all of a sudden got strong once LeBron left is because he left. I think that doesn't take into account anything about how the East was already trending. The Cavaliers were already bleeding out last year. Like, they were bleeding the entire season. They bled into the playoffs. These other teams, you don't think they smelled that blood? So then to this, people respond, okay, well, we'll give you last year, because if you're just dealing in facts, then there's no way that you think that Cleveland team from last year scares any of these Eastern teams this year. There's no way you truly believe that. So if you're not arguing against that, then the next response is, oh, well, what about the last 7 years then? There weren't these major moves in. Nobody was trading for like a Jimmy Butler then. What happened there? Alright, I'll explain it because I watched this intensely. In 2011, the East was still competing heavily with LeBron even though he went to Miami. They built what at the time was seen as one of the best big threes ever, but the teams that were in positions, they still made their runs. The Bulls went and got Carlos Boozer for Derrick Rose. They were like the best defensive team in the league that year, I believe. Rose wins the MVP. They're clearly contending and they were clearly shooting for the finals. Boston retooled heavily. They went out and got Shaq, Jermaine O'Neal. Mainly their moves for 2011 involved getting a lot of players for the bench because they thought the big three needed more rest. They were fresh off their finals loss to LA, so going into 2011 the thought was that, okay, we need better bench support. We need better support around the big three. So those were the serious contenders for 2011. The Celtics had their injuries, and by the time they got to Miami, Rondo even injured his elbow. They were beaten. And then they see the 60-62 win Chicago Bulls in the Eastern Conference Finals. That was the best team that LeBron James beat over his entire run in the East. The Derrick Rose MVP Bulls. That's the best team that they beat the entire time. And also, that's the only healthy team he ever played in the East that had an All-NBA first player. I'm going to get to the contingency on that in a minute. So we get to 2012 and Boston is on their last leg. And then the Bulls. The Chicago Bulls actually did make moves to try to get better. They went out and signed Rip Hamilton that year. They tried to get some of the pieces that they thought were missing in the 2011 run. And then Derrick Rose got injured. That's a big story right there. Because Derrick Rose being injured, that was one of the top competitors that was supposed to compete with LeBron for years and years to come. That's an MVP level player that was taken out of the game. He's off the board now. So then that year, it kind of defaulted to the Boston Celtics. Then you get to the year 2013. The Celtics are now completely off the board, and now the East has defaulted to the Indiana Pacers. They were the next best thing after the Celtics fell off, after the Bulls were taken out by injury. And by the way, the Knicks made a run that year. The Knicks won either 60 games or close to 60 games, and that was the year that they went out and got a lot of help. You had Rasheed Wallace and Jason Kidd coming off the bench. They had Tyson Chandler. Like, that team, that was one of the best teams not to be in the Eastern Conference Finals. So to say that nobody had been making runs in this last 7 years, that's what I'm talking about. And I'm building up to where this is going to make more sense, by the way. But so that year, the Pacers take them to 7, and now they're officially on the map. Paul George has officially put himself on the board. They lose the series in 7. The next year, the Brooklyn Nets try to put themselves on the map hilariously by trading for Paul Pierce and KG to pair them with Darren Williams, Joe Johnson, and Brook Lopez. Too little too late, and Brook Lopez had the foot injury, so they were never whole anyways, but that was a move that they tried to make to run for the East. And by the way, as we got close to the playoffs that year, Evan Turner was seen as a valuable asset back then. He was seen as a really good player. The Pacers traded for him, which actually had an adverse effect. There was chemistry issues. I remember they had like a fight in practice or something, but that was something that they tried to push themselves over the Miami Heat because they were first seed that year, but they lost. They lost in 5 or 6 games. So let's pause real quick and, let's regather where we are. So far at this point, the Celtics, the Bulls, the Pacers, and the Nets have all made really strong moves to try and win the East. The Celtics fell off after injury and age, the Pacers and Bulls fell off after injury, and the Nets, that whole experiment just never really got off the ground. Now, in the summer of 2014, when LeBron James goes back to Cleveland, Paul George breaks his leg in a Team USA scrimmage. That's the end of what Indiana was building. They had been dueling with LeBron and trying to best him for the last 2 years. The star player of that whole thing just broke his leg and misses pretty much the entire year. That's out now. Now in 2015, 2 very high-level players in the East are gone. So in 2015, the Eastern Conference has now defaulted to a heavily pretending Atlanta Hawks team, a Chicago Bulls team hoping and praying that Derrick Rose can stay healthy, but he's not even close to what he was back in 2011, and a Toronto Raptors team that will forever be known as pretenders. They're forever going to be known as a team that no matter how good they got, LeBron just owned them. Okay, now we're at a very important part in this story, because teams that have tried to gear up a run at LeBron James's throne, they've either tried to do that or have been taken out by injuries. So the East has defaulted to much weaker teams than we would have had if Paul George and Rose were around. And now LeBron James has created another strong team with Kyrie and Kevin Love. What happens there, and it answers the question, people are like, well, now you see that was a myth about teams not trying to really make a run at beating LeBron. Now we're at a point where that rings kinda true. But so many teams, again, we've defaulted to weaker teams. These teams are very far away from the power of the teams that LeBron is playing on now. Nobody on the East is really that close to a team with LeBron, Kyrie, and Kevin Love. So at that point, it doesn't make sense for a lot of teams to go and make crazy moves like you see them making right now. At that point, it doesn't make sense because we're past the teams that were contending a few years ago. We're even lower now to like the Washington Wizards of the world. Teams like the Isaiah Thomas Boston Celtics that are just, they're freshly minted. They're just now building. They're not even in position to really make a huge run just yet. That stuff takes time. So 2015 is the last time that the Bulls are relevant at all. And again, I'm on record saying that I thought that team was going to beat Cleveland because of the suspension and injuries. And they had made another run. They went and got Pau Gasol that summer. That was yet another team that did try to tool up and did try to get to Cleveland's level. Alright, so I'm just going to now read off from the year 2015 to 2017. They beat the Boston Celtics that had just gotten Isaiah Thomas, Chicago Bulls, like I said, that's the last we ever see of them, then the Atlanta Hawks, who everybody knew was pretenders. We get to 2016. That year they played the Detroit Pistons. And by the way, that series was actually closer than it looks. It was 4-0, but I remember the Pistons being in most of those games. They played the Atlanta Hawks again, who were just, they were pretenders one year and now just nobody's even paying attention to them. Then they take out the Toronto Raptors. This is the first time that they play them in the playoffs. That series goes 4-2. Then we get to 2017. They play the Pacers in the first round. This is a Pacer team that is much lesser than the one that they were facing a couple of years ago when LeBron was in Miami. They play the Toronto Raptors again, 4-0. Nobody believes in them in the first place except for people in Toronto. Then you get the Boston Celtics, who at the time were being spoke of as one of the most vulnerable one seeds ever. As a matter of fact, if the Bulls had not have experienced injuries in the first round, they probably would have lost because they were down 0-2. They had lost both of their home games. And again, that was a Bulls team that made a small run. They went and got Rondo, then they had Dwayne Wade to pair with Jimmy Butler. Tough season for them, but when you got to the playoff version of that team and it looked like they could beat the Celtics, people were interested in seeing what they could do against a Cleveland team. So then we get to where this video started in 2018, where the Cleveland Cavaliers have just fallen apart. They've started to bleed out, and by that time, years have passed. The Celtics have been able to execute on their plan. They now have Kyrie, and they look like legitimate contenders this time. Giannis Antetokounmpo was growing up that whole time. The Pacers have wiped themselves clean of Paul George and now is starting with Oladipo. The Sixers are finally healthy. They finally have Ben Simmons and Joel Embiid on the court together. That was something that was playing out that entire time as well. All that stuff just happened to culminate into last year where Cleveland was bleeding out. We get to the playoffs, some injuries happen, Cleveland makes it one more time. And here we are now in 2019 where the East has rebuilt itself. Players that were developing, teams that were developing for the entire time that LeBron was there, teams that were growing up, they're now just at that point. This stuff just takes time. So there's two things that I've addressed in this video, two specific things. One is the myth that there were no teams even trying over the last 8 years, because there actually were teams that were trying, and the ones that did try either aged out or were taken out by injury, which defaulted to the next round of teams that were not as good as those guys, and even some of them tried. But for much of the East, it didn't make sense for like blockbuster moves because none of them were close to a Cleveland Cavaliers team that had 3 stars on it. Nobody was close to that in the East. And then the second thing I addressed was how Cleveland bled out. Their run as the unquestioned champion of the East ended last year. They still won it, but more people than ever saw them losing. I would agree more with his statement if he said that me and Kyrie aren't playing together in the East anymore, so now it's wide open. That statement makes more sense. LeBron James on a team like last year in a conference full of healthy, star-powered teams like we have right now, that's a different story. The Eastern Conference is not great right now because LeBron James left it. Many stories that were being built many years ago have just culminated to right now. And just so you can leave this video with some food for thought, what Eastern Conference teams besides the 2011 Chicago Bulls can you even argue are better than the 4 top teams in the East right now, meaning the Boston Celtics, 76ers, the Milwaukee Bucks, and the Toronto Raptors? Besides the 2011 Bulls, what East teams during that 8-year run were better than them? Those teams did not just assemble overnight because LeBron left. If you're going to argue that the Celtics' health being here this year, Kawhi Leonard being in the East this year, the Milwaukee Bucks shaking it up this year, and the Sixers trading for Butler this year was all because LeBron James wasn't on a very subpar team here to stop them, I need a very good explanation as to why. You couldn't even argue something like the Tobias Harris move has to do with LeBron not being here. That has to do with the fact that this East is really good and the Sixers needed something to try to really catch up because I think that they were falling behind. And if you're going to argue that no team in the last 8 years made a move to try to beat LeBron James, I need you to argue against what I presented pretty much throughout this video, because I showed you specific moves that were geared towards that and how it was taken out. Respect to what LeBron James did, but my final argument is that from like 2011 to 2015, a lot of teams did try to beat him. A lot of them were knocked off by injuries or age. They were replaced by inferior teams for the next few years, and the teams that we see now have been in the works for those few years. I need to know where that assessment is wrong because history does not change.